Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Redwood Library in Athenæum in Newport, Rhode Island. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director. We are very glad indeed, as always, to welcome back Dr. Edward Markward for his Music Appreciation Series as he continues with his discussion on American composers. Tonight's lecture is the 9th installment of the series, and it is devoted to Charles Ives, an American icon lately discovered. This program is generously sponsored, as always, by the Jarzembek family, Mark Jarzembek and Michelle Drum. So we're very grateful to them, as well as Dr. Markward himself. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Markward.
Thank you, Benedict, and welcome everyone to this brief study of one of America's greatest composers. He was born in 1874 in Danbury, Connecticut, and lived until 1954. He was an American impressionist and a modernist working on his own. Unlike his contemporaries in Europe, which would include the late Debussy, Ravel, Stravinsky, people of that nature, there is no precedent for what Ives was doing in America. I think one of the keys to Ives' psyche and his way of carrying himself and composing is from a statement that his father made to him when he was a young man. It's one of his father's most resonant pieces of wisdom. He said of his stonemason's off-key hymn singing, "Look into his face and hear the music of the ages. Don't pay too much attention to the sounds, for if you do, you may miss the music." Ives graduated in 1898 from Yale University with a D+ average. I'm not sure anyone would graduate with that average today. And he headed for New York City to take a job in an insurance company, the Mutual Insurance Company of New York. He later founded his own and became a millionaire. The main reason that he chose this vocation was so that he could follow his avocation, i.e. composing music, without any hindrance or any criticism that would stop him. He was a great composer, and we're going to start with a piece that he composed when he was 17 years old. It's called Variations on America. We know it as My Country 'Tis of Thee. Across the pond, it's known as God Save the King. And he composed it first for organ. It was later orchestrated by William Schumann when he was at Juilliard, the president of Juilliard School of Music. And that's the version we're going to hear, the orchestra version of America by Charles Ives. obviously not devoid of humor. This piece, as I said, was first written for organ by Ives. And he says about the low brass part in this orchestration, but the pedal part for organ toward the end of the fifth variation, there are five variations, that it was almost as fun to play the pedal part as it was to play baseball. The pedal part. Keep in mind that Charles Ives was 17 when he wrote that arrangement of America. He was 14 when he became the youngest professional organist choir director in the state of Connecticut. What we do know, and why I say discovered lately, is he worked in obscurity for most of his career as a composer. As I mentioned, he was an insurance executive, the CEO of his own company after a few years. And as he worked in obscurity, he wrote what he wanted to write. And it's very experimental music, which we will find as we move forward through these pieces. He chose this career as an insurance executive, as he put it. If a composer has a nice wife and some nice children, how can he let them starve on his dissonances? He is the first to create a distinctive body of American music. We talked last time about the Boston Six, who were romantic composers, but most of the John Knowles Paine, Horatio Parker, and so on. But they wrote in a European style, flavored a bit of Americana, but mostly it was an imitation of a European style. Charles Ives was his own iconoclastic self and wrote what he wanted to write. He wrote four numbered symphonies and a symphony called the Holiday Symphony, which we will talk about momentarily. His big pieces: Three Places in New England, The Unanswered Question, two string quartets, a piano trio, four violin sonatas, two piano sonatas, and over 200 songs, which we will hear a couple of, I hope, as time presses on. And he was one of the first composers of international renown, albeit rather late. I have two composers who were the forerunners of music in the early 20th century in Europe, and then they both moved to America. They are Arnold Schoenberg, and he said in a letter discovered by his wife after Schoenberg passed away, "There is a great man living in this country, a composer. He has solved the problem how to preserve one's self-esteem and to learn. He responds to negligence by contempt. He is not forced to accept praise or blame. His name is Ives." And Igor Stravinsky in 1966 said, "Ives was exploring the 60s during the heyday of Strauss and Debussy. Polytonality, atonality, tone clusters, effects, chants, statistical composition, permutation, add a part, practical joke, and improvisatory music. These were Ives' discoveries a half century ago as he quietly set about devouring the contemporary cake before the rest of us even found a seat at the table." There are four areas in which Ives excelled in composition. They were vernacular music, and these all had influences on him: parlor songs, marches, hymns, and the like. Protestant church music, he was a professional church organist, as we pointed out, so he improvised preludes and hymns and postludes and so on. European classical music, as an organist, he did play many of Bach and the other organists of the day. And then the experimental works, which most of us know him for and required the most intensive study. He was the first composer to use polytonality systematically. By that, we mean two keys or more at once. And we heard a little bit of this a couple of sessions ago when Ives was mentioned. Psalm 67 is a perfect example of that, in that the men are singing in the key of G minor and the ladies in the key of C major. Here's a bit of Psalm 67. And I believe we did listen to some of this Psalm 67 the last time we talked about Ives, so I'm not going to play much more of that because there is so much more music to get to this evening. That was written in 1894 when Ives was a freshman at Yale. In the same year, he wrote a piece called The Circus Band. And it's the last set in 5 songs that Ives called 5 street songs, written while the composer, as I said, was a student at Yale. They are primarily tonal pieces, but with moments of unexpected rhythmic transformations. I think in this case, you'll be able to tell that because of the rhythm, it almost sounds like some band members are tripping. By that, I mean with their feet, not anything else. He also threw in a sprinkling of wrong notes, and for him, that was a nod toward the amateur aspect of these bands. He grew up listening to these bands. His father, George, was a band master in Danbury, Connecticut. He liked, the father, George, liked to experiment with music as well. He would play the piano in one key while the melody being sung was in another key. He envisioned bands starting at both ends of Danbury, Connecticut, each playing a different piece and meeting in the middle. This kind of experimentation was not lost, I'm sure, on Charles Ives. And you will find there are very serious moments in Ives, and then there are the playful moments, such as here in The Circus Band. Let me read you part of the text first. All summer long, we boys dreamed about circus joys. Down Main Street comes the band. Oh, ain't it a grand and glorious noise? Horses are prancing, knights advancing, helmets gleaming, pennants streaming. Cleopatra's on her throne. The golden hair is all her own. Where is the lady all in pink? Last year she waved to me, I think. Can she have died? Can that rot? She is passing, but she sees me not. The Circus Band by Charles Ives, 1894. etc. The next piece we're going to listen to is from the Holidays Symphony, which Ives began in 1897 and finished in 1913. Part of Ives' way of going was to begin works or have fragments of works and glue them together as time went on. He revised many of his pieces in the 40s after his music had been somewhat discovered. But he was prone to take a long time to write these massive pieces, these symphonies and sonatas and so on. We're going to take a look at the Concord Sonata a little later on. One of the things that Ives was famous for and is famous for is putting hymns, marches, and parlor songs into other works that are called symphonies and so on. The Holidays Symphony celebrates 4 of the America's holidays: Washington's birthday, Decoration Day, which we now know as Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving. We're going to give a listen to Decoration Day in just a moment. Ives had this to say about this collection of 4 movements into one symphony, about the Holidays Symphony. There is no special music connection among these 4 movements, which leads me to observe that quite a number of larger forms, symphonies, sonatas, suites, etc., may not always necessarily form an organic whole. And he was talking not about his own music necessarily, but about any music, including the big romantic pieces by Brahms and Schumann and so on. Decoration Day, which is what we are going to listen to, was completed in 1912 or 13, and he arranged the piece for a huge orchestra, and it lasts about 9 to 10 minutes, and we will not listen to the whole thing. Toward the end, there is a trumpet imitating a military bugle. I've based this piece on what he saw of his father's band playing funerals on Decoration Day in the local cemetery. And the band would march from the middle of town to the cemetery. The service would take place for the burial. Ives, young Charles, would play taps on the trumpet, and then the band would recede back to the middle of town again, playing a joyous celebration. Decoration Day begins with an extended meditative section, which is very typical of Ives, and we'll hear a couple of other movements along the same lines, and it's mostly for strings, and it symbolizes mourning. Now, mourning can be spelled 2 ways, and this is both. Morning as in early daytime, also mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, and the awakening of memory as we remember the deceased at the cemetery. So here's a bit of Ives' Holiday Symphony, the second movement, Decoration Day. major and minor keys together, bitonality. Not too offensive, I don't think. Moving on to where taps comes in or close to it. This is another example, or one of the prime examples, of Ives using other sources than his own imagination. He builds by using tunes like Marching Through Georgia, Tending Tonight on the Old Campground. And after we hear taps, we will hear the Second Regimental March played by the band. So it goes out, leaving the cemetery with a rather joyful Second Regimental March, and then he will end as he began, with this sort of meditative slow music in the strings. Excuse me, it's hard to see this. The meditative music that we heard at the beginning. And it ends with the traditional Amen. As you noticed here, there's a mingling of styles, and Ives uses the dissonance to enlarge his palette of colors and meanings that he can put to his own use. It gave his works a very big dynamic range of emotions. And almost all of his works have this combination of slow meditative music combined with either fast or rollicking music or marches as we just heard. Interestingly, the score of Decoration Day, which I mentioned was finished in 1912 or 1913, was not published until 1989. It's a long time coming. The next example we are going to turn our attention to is Symphony Number 3, The Camp Meeting. It has three movements: Old Folks Gathering, Children's Day is the second, and Communion is the third. Ives referred to the third symphony itself as a pivotal symphony in his growth as a composer. It was a cross between the older ways and the newer ways. By older ways, Ives was referring to the classical model of symphonic writing in both of his previous symphonies, and the newer ways were to be found in his extensive use of borrowings or found materials, such as, we just heard the Second Regimental March and other pieces in the Decoration Day. He began to use more and more popular songs, religious hymns, and folk tunes that were placed in a traditionally oriented formal symphonic framework. The second movement, Children's Day, is rather a happy, animated romp featuring the hymns Fountain, Naomi, and the Happy Land in counterpoint against one another. And a march fills the middle section, and the movement ends with a coda. Gustav Mahler, who was roughly a contemporary, or writing at least at the same time that Ives was, had seen the manuscript and talked of premiering the symphony with the New York Philharmonic. According to Ives, Mahler took the score back to Europe, planning to conduct it there. But of course, he died in 1911. The alleged score has never been located. And there was no further interest in this symphony until Lou Harrison, a composer and a great fan of Ives' music, conducted it in 1946. Another composer, Bernard Herrmann, who became a friend of Ives, conducted a CBS broadcast performance of the symphony soon after that. And this symphony was completed in 1918. And again, I refer to the lately discovered music of Charles Ives. This symphony, the third symphony, won the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1947. Later advocates of Ives were Harrison, the aforementioned Harrison, Aaron Copland, and then Leonard Bernstein, Greg Smith, and certainly Michael Tilson Thomas, whose recording we are listening to most today. So let's give a listen to the camp meeting, the second movement, Children's Day. Use of the hymn tunes right here. And so on. In 1906, Ives composed probably the first radical composition of the 20th century. It's entitled Central Park in the Dark. It was first titled A Contemplation of Nothing Serious, or Central Park in the Dark in the Good Old Summertime. And here the strings represent the night sounds and silent darkness, and there are interruptions from the casino in Central Park and so on. We'll play just a bit of it. It is paired with another piece he wrote at about the same time. He began it in 1906 and completed it in 1908. It was influenced by the New England writers Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. It's called Contemplation of a Serious Matter, or the Unanswered Perennial Question, shortened to, for all intents and purposes, the unanswered question. First, Central Park in the Dark. faintly you can hear the piano in the distance. When we listen to these two pieces of Charles Ives, who was operating without precedent in the United States in writing this, what was termed far out music, although no one heard it at the time, keep in mind what was going on in Europe with the real serious composers. It's not long after Debussy had written Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun. It was before Stravinsky had written Firebird, Petrushka, or The Rite of Spring. And here was Ives operating all on his own in this country, coming up with atonality, polytonality, independent of Schoenberg or Webern or Berg in Europe. He's the first to combine tonal and atonal layers in the same piece. In The Unanswered Question, as I mentioned, influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, the unanswered question, or the question is, why are we here? The part of that question is taken by the solo trumpet against the background of offstage strings, playing very tonal music, very softly, very quietly. And then there's a woodwind quintet or four flutes, which attempt to answer the question, but become increasingly agitated by the re-asking and re-asking by the trumpet of the question. Here's the unanswered question. I'm going to cut in. It's so soft we won't hear it. The question asked by the trumpet, why are we here? The woodwinds respond atonally, aimless. Moving ahead. They become very impatient. And the last time they enter, they cut the trumpet off, asking the question, so that the question remains unanswered, which incidentally was the title of Leonard Bernstein's Norton Lectures at Harvard in the 70s. This is now American program music, much like Richard Strauss was writing in Europe, except Ives confined this all to New England and New York. And he next wrote three places in New England. The three places are Saint-Gaudens or St. Gaudens in the Boston Common dedication statue for Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Mass Regiment, the first volunteer African American unit in the Civil War. The second is Putnam's Camp in Reading, Connecticut, the band playing at a 4th of July picnic, and you hear all kinds of interference. And then the last is the Housatonic at Stockbridge, which is of special importance to Ives. It's because it's where he and his wife took walks along that river during their honeymoon after their marriage. We're going to listen to, for a little bit of liveliness, the second place in New England, Putnam's Camp. All kinds of things going on the 4th of July. Catch all the tunes going on. You can hear all of these things coming into his mind at a picnic. It's as if we're watching a parade, and as one of the entries marches on by and goes out toward this side, we can still hear them, and the other one is coming down the street and we hear it approaching, and at some point we hear them both, although neither very clearly. I want to next turn to one of his most famous pieces, the Concord Sonata, or Piano Sonata number 2, Concord, Mass, 1840 to 1860, in which the movements celebrate Thoreau, Emerson, the Alcotts, and so on. And I can't remember the fourth. I'll find it at some point. Thoreau, Emerson, Hawthorne, the Alcotts. And he wrote what are called essays before a sonata, one before each movement. And here is the first essay, the prologue. How far is anyone justified, be he an authority or a layman, in expressing or trying to express in terms of music, in sounds if you like, the value of anything material, moral, intellectual, or spiritual, which is usually expressed in terms other than music? And remember now that Ives is writing a great deal of program music. Even in his symphonies, there are programs attached. So in these particular movements of the sonata, there's a hymn-like melody and a harmonization. There's polytonality layered with diatonic chords, whole tone accompaniment, all the things that are at his disposal. Modernist counterpoint passages, Scottish songs, everything you can imagine is in here, including in all movements, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I'm going to play as much of it as I can of the movement entitled The Alcotts, and it opens immediately with a very soft rendition of the Beethoven Fifth. This was written between 1911 and 1915. A little bit of ragtime. He introduces these little fragments of tunes into the mainstream of the movement, and then it seems nonchalantly moves away from them. But since he worked on this sonata from 1911 to 1915, 1920 it was published, and then he revised it, and the final version was not published until 1947. I think these insertions are anything but nonchalant. Moving on, I want to talk briefly about the Fourth Symphony. Some time ago, we played the fugue. Again, this symphony requires two conductors. It's a humongous orchestra. And according to one scribe, it makes the rite of spring pale by comparison in its difficulties. There is the fugue from this Fourth Symphony, which sort of takes a breath out of all this complexity. He combines two hymn tunes and writes this fugue for the third movement. From Greenland's icy mountains, and then at the end there's a fragment of Joy to the World. Organ. And so on. This Fourth Symphony was a philosophical work in Ives' mind. And again, it comes to this. The searching questions of what and why are posited in the first movement, and then the next three movements attempt to answer those questions, much as the unanswered question, which we heard a bit ago. One of Ives' later, oh, by the way, he wrote this symphony, the Fourth Symphony, between 1910 and the 20s. And a complete performance was not given until 1965, conducted by Stokowski, which was half a century after it was completed and a decade after Ives' death. So he never did hear it performed. I want to play two last bits for you. One is one of Ives' songs written in 1919. And I should mention that after the mid-20s, I may have mentioned it already, Ives ceased composing. He had a series of heart attacks, which rendered him physically unable to continue. He developed a tremor in his right hand. And also, it has been said that perhaps he just ran out of ideas after 30 years of experimenting with sound. Here is General William Booth Enters into Heaven. And it is one of the great Ives pieces, I think. The text, I will read to you at least part of it. General William Booth, of course, was the founder, along with his wife, of the Salvation Army. He was an English Methodist preacher. And here we go. Ives quotes many times the hymn, "Are You Washed in the Blood of the Lamb?" Booth led boldly with his big bass drum. This was written in 1920 or so. "Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?" The saints smiled gravely and they said, "He's come. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?" Walking lepers followed, rank on rank, lurching bravos from the ditches dank, drabs from the alleyways and drug fiends pale, minds still passion-ridden, soul powers frail, vermin-eaten saints with moldy breath, unwashed legions from the ways of death. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? And then the final verse, wherever it went, sorry. Anyway, Jesus entered the courtyard, and you'll hear the change in the mood of the piece. This is a great piece, very, very difficult. This is the San Francisco Symphony with Michael Tilson Thomas, chorus, and the great baritone Thomas Hampson. The bass drum. Next month, we'll be talking about Rhode Island composers.
Washed in the blood of the Lamb. Saints smiled bravely and they said, "He's come." You washed in the blood of the Lamb. The blood of the Lamb. Walking that was on break away. Let you troubles from the ditches play. And from the alleyways and from feet's pale, I'm still passionate, so powers frail.
The poem is by Rachel Lindsay.
And transcendent eyes. Transcendental, they shriek and sing, they shriek and sing. Are you lost in the blood of the Lamb? It was clear to see. One-legged convicts with that land made free. Those with trumpets blow the Jesus came from the courthouse door, stretched his hands above the passing saw not but let his wheel once round and round almighty courthouse square. Yet, in an instant, all had clearly killed.
We have 1 minute left, so I think maybe we should end on something really fun and positive. As I mentioned, Ives wrote over 200 songs. Here's one called Ann Street, which was written in 1921. The text is by Maurice Morris. Quaint name Ann Street, width of same 10 feet. Barnum's mob, Ann Street. Far from obsolete, narrow, yes, Ann Street, but business, both feet. Sun just hits, Ann Street, then it quits. Some greet, rather short, Ann Street. This is Gil Kalish and Jan de Gaetani.
Broadway.
Thank you for coming. See you next month.